This is a talk about starting a podcast. My name is Dr. Charles Woods. I'm an assistant professor of English at Texas A&M University Commerce. Feel free to reach out to me via my email address, charles.woods@tamuc.edu, or follow me on Twitter at Charles_Woods1. After the chat today, if you'd like to follow up with any questions. The reason that these things are so exciting for us scholars to do is building connections, and certainly learning more about the work of students at ISU is exciting to me. I encourage you after the talk to visit the podcast website, the bigrhetoricalpodcast.weebly.com, and follow the podcast on Twitter at the Big Red. So if you don't mind, spend just about 5 minutes walking through what's your name, what's your major, and your role. For example, I know that we have some faculty member here today, perhaps graduate students, undergraduates. Number 3, if you could produce and host a podcast about any topic, what would it be and why? And who is one person you would want to interview for this podcast? Number 4. Number 5, what are 1 or 2 questions you want to ask this person or group? And number 6, why is this interview important? And number 7, how do you get in touch with these people or person or people? And you may not know the answer to that. So if that's IDK, that's okay. So spend a moment, and since you all have the slides yourself, it works perfectly because you can just kind of stick there as I tell you a little bit about my podcasting life. So a little bit about this podcasting life, my podcasting life. I began podcasting as a way to communicate with friends in 2016. And then in 2017, when I moved away from where most of my friends lived, it became an even more viable means for communicating with them. In 2018, as Dr. Ellison mentioned in her gracious introduction, I created the Big Rhetorical Podcast in Stevenson 312 at ISU. I think, is that maybe a thumbs up? Is that the conference room, right, with where the seminars meet, the graduate seminars meet, right across from the English office? It might not be Stevenson 312. I might have those numbers messed up, but it's that seminar room right across from ISU is where the Big Rhetorical Podcast began. And with that podcast, I wanted to work to amplify the work of graduate students. That was one of its goals. But its second goal, while not a goal when I started out, it became clear that what I was doing with creating this podcast and with podcasting is a grassroots approach to collective knowledge or collective knowledge making. So I've been toiling away in the sound studio of the guest bedroom of my house, I guess, for the last 5 years or so. And now in 2023, I've made headways in legitimizing podcasts as academic discourse in my own field. And the way that I've done that, and one of the ways, that I've done that is through publications. As Dr. Ellison mentioned, the first podcast review manuscript of, so that's an extended manuscript beyond just beyond a book review, was published in Computers and Composition. And in May, a second piece that's working to continue to legitimize podcasts and thinking of them in terms of research, has come a new piece on infusing feminist research methods in creating podcasts and producing and doing research for podcasts and producing podcasts. So that's a little bit about my podcasting life. So here's a little bit more about the Big Rhetorical Podcast. The early ideas between me and my peer Matt were to discuss innovative writing studies pedagogy. In 2017, when we began the program in the doctoral program at ISU, podcasts were really emerging, or they had emerged, but were really emerging in mainstream media as a genre for knowledge and also for social change. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. So there was it was a kairotic moment to make that intervention and introduce podcasting as a continued podcasting in rhetoric and composition. And we did that. One of the things we did on the podcast was focus on experiences implementing technology in the classroom. So we were focused on writing studies pedagogy, but that's a lot and it's large. So what we really talked about in those early episodes was experiences implementing technology in the classroom. These are many of the classes that you've taken. English 145, 140, English 145, 13, the writing program courses as well, the 100 level sequence, and technical communication. A new approach emerged. I worked and established the Emerging Scholar series early on to amplify the work of graduate students. Matt moved away from podcasting, and I was trying to find like a groove, a way that my podcasting could be meaningful for the people who I talk to. And so I worked to amplify the work of graduate students. And then one thing I also did was start talking to people with new books or new projects that they want to talk about. I've rambled on here for like 8 minutes straight. And one of the things that you can tell already probably is that academics love to talk about themselves and their work. And so I developed, and that's an important part of their job too, though. That shouldn't be forgotten. In this podcast, then I worked to establish relationships with academic presses to filter new titles and new authors. So the University of Minnesota Press, Penn State University Press, Ohio State University Press, and others, and presses in my field, like the Computers and Composition Digital Press. I established relationships with them to filter me authors and new titles to interview on the podcast. And then once I really got going into this, project after 2 or 3 years in the middle of COVID, I started expanding the scope of what I could do. I'm in a piece I'm writing about podcast spaces. I argue that podcasts are much more than a single sound file uploaded to an RSS feed. And so I started really thinking about what all podcasts could be, and I expanded the scope of my own project. I established a nonprofit organization, which allowed me to raise money and give the awards to graduate students that I was interviewing. And so I created the TBR Emerging Scholar Award. And later, if you want, we can get to some of the nitty gritty of that, going to the bank, setting up a nonprofit account, learning the different corporate and nonprofit organizational structures in the state you're in Illinois, where I founded it. And I also created the TBR Fellowship, which is a paid opportunity for graduate students to work on the podcast, to get practical experience in technical communication, producing podcasts that they can carry on with them in their careers. So the newest thing I've been doing is engaging with undergraduate interns across institutions. And this is actually international in scope because one of the institutions is in Toronto. So I have undergraduate interns in business writing, technical communication, and publishing in York University in Toronto and Utah State University in Utah, obviously, are working on the podcast in different ways. This is in the form of surveys to think about how we can extend our reach, bring in new audiences, and create a bigger digital footprint. And also, some of them are working towards establishing us in other digital spaces. We have a Facebook page and a Twitter account, but some of these interns have worked to create TikTok, put us on TikTok, which is super cool. I guess I need to put TikTok on my intro slide now. You can follow the podcast on TikTok. So here's the big question. Why podcasting? Why is your university, your department investing in podcasting in a way? Podcasting is a viable digital genre for legitimate knowledge making and circulation in rhetoric and writing studies, because podcasts coalesce with values of the field like access, community, and social justice. And so this is an argument that I make in the newest piece, the podcast review manuscript, as we go through some of these things and think about what the different podcasts in my area are doing for the field. And so we'll talk about justice a little bit from a local perspective, but I want to highlight two things when it comes to podcasts and podcasting. First, access. Podcasts maintain technological constraints. A podcast is much more than a single sound file on an RSS feed because it needs to include things like a transcript. And images should, when you're promoting online, need to include alternative text. But also we can think about access in terms of knowledge. Remember, legitimate knowledge making and circulation. Podcasts represent a way to a new venue to access knowledge. And this goes for both public and academic discourse. And my argument, I think there is that podcasts are a perfect medium for merging public and academic discourse, which should be a value of the humanities. And then community. I wanted to say something about podcasting and podcast communities. If you're going to start a podcast, you have to be a part of the community. Certainly podcasts build community, but podcasters have to engage with the community. This means in social media groups, listening to other people's podcasts, sharing, liking, subscribing. And one of the things I started doing early on about this year will be our fourth annual the Big Rhetorical Podcast Carnival. So I got the community of podcasters in rhetoric and composition, and it's a thing, and we've had a moment, and it might be nearing a turn, right? But podcasting and rhetoric and composition is a thing. And so I got all the podcasts together, and we create podcasts each year for a week-long carnival that's very much like a blog carnival. And around a certain topic. So we've done things like fake news and digital futures. These topics tend to be very general or broad so that different podcasts can approach them in different ways to reach their audiences. Let's keep heading along. So I'm on slide 7 now. Sonic intimacy and interviewing. So when I was approached to put together this workshop, I was thinking like starting a podcast. Okay, what do I know about starting a podcast? I could give you a list of equipment ideas or something like that. But then I thought what would be much more appropriate was to talk about what I can, to bring something to the table about what I do, and that's interview podcasts. So that's kind of where we're going to turn. We're going to turn towards sonic intimacy and interviewing. A podcast almost exclusively relies on the sonic mode. Now, this is in complete tension with what I said earlier about a podcast being more than a sound file. I know. But the second part, but we're thinking specifically about sonic right here. And nuanced sonic intimacy between the podcaster and the audience. Consider many podcasts, and this goes back, I think the student's name was Raven, if I caught that correctly. Consider that podcasts are delivered, many of them are delivered via headphones, right, or earbuds. And often those headphones or earbuds specifically are embedded into the ear, right, in your body, and which I think is a contributing factor to this idea of intimacy. So when thinking about interviewing and this idea of sonic intimacy, there are certain considerations that one has to make. Are you going to do a long form interview or a short form interview? A long form interview might run over 30 minutes to 45 minutes and an hour, whereas a short form interview could be shorter, 5 to 15 minutes perhaps. The next thing to consider is single subject versus a free-ranging topic. A free-ranging interview with various topics. For example, in my interviews usually are free-ranging, depending on their subject or the interviewee. Talking to grad students, it's a lot of free-ranging discussions about their research interests that kind of end on their current research threads or perhaps dissertation or thesis topic. But when I'm talking to an author about a book that they're promoting, this is primarily a single subject interview where we talk about the book, how it came to be, how they hope it might be used in classrooms, et cetera, stuff like that. Be adaptable and flexible in the way that you approach interviews and conducting interviews, but also booking interviews. Develop a tone that works for you. Balance your own voice with the voice of others. When I go to like transcribe an interview that I've done on the Big Rhetorical podcast, it's oftentimes me and then like minutes and minutes and minutes of the other person, and then just like me, one little line with a question or two, and then minutes and minutes and minutes of the person I'm interviewing. And that's kind of my tone, though, right? That I'm trying to set. I want the interviewer to have the platform to demonstrate their brilliance. Style is another important consideration when thinking about conducting podcast interviews. Are you going to be serious or funny? Are you going to be informational or irreverent? When I got started the podcast that I work on, the Big Rhetorical podcast, I was having more fun and maybe being a little bit more irreverent. And as I realized the power, I suppose, that we were thinking about, the power of the podcast, I kind of shifted gears and created a more serious tone, perhaps an informational tone. And I've struggled with style. I've struggled with style throughout especially in those early days, getting started. And then finally, audience. Who do you want to reach? Do you want to reach people in a certain who like a certain movie, or like research a certain subject, or interested in a certain team or event, or music or personality or influencer, etc.? How can you extend that reach and bring in new audiences that might be interested in that topic by connecting to their personal? So I wanted to tell you a little bit about my interview process on the Big Rhetorical podcast. So first, identify guests and engage in booking. I mentioned earlier that this might include working with academic presses that I've had relationships with. It means going on Twitter. It means keeping and seeing what people are promoting in my field. It means going to keep up with what leading academic journals are publishing in the field. And then consider how I want to conduct the interview, or how you want to conduct the interview. What platform works best for you? There are certainly web-based platforms for recording podcasts. You might use a video conferencing platform like Zoom or Skype. I use Zoom. I record it as an MP4 video file. I convert it to an MP3 file and destroy the MP4 file and perform audio editing. I use closed captions because I'm a grassroots podcaster and I don't have any money. Like, I raise money and give that money to graduate students. And I don't have, I'm a college professor, so I don't have a surplus of money here. So I use closed captioning on Zoom to produce a transcript and then edit the transcript based on the final audio file. So that's an important thing to think about, how we can be flexible and innovative in the different technologies we use to lead to more accessible products and podcasts. Number 4, once confirmed, ask if the guest wants questions ahead of the interview. That's incredibly important, as it creates a better environment and really hones in on this idea of collaboration, right? And that's what a podcast is a collaboration. Ask for a bio from the interviewee beforehand, so you know what you're getting into, you know who you're interviewing. But also, many of the people that you interview are going to have diverse interests and different ideas about that they might want to share. And so you might want to think about that. You might remind interviewees to take their time, embrace pauses because they might not have done a podcast before. Start with an icebreaker question, which is something that I'm really that I do. Take notes intently and develop follow-up questions. Plan transitions ahead of time. This could be pre-interview or during the interview, in interview, and continue contact with the interview throughout publication in case issues arise. So I want to move on to the next part of the workshop, finding guests to interview. As you're looking for folks to interview, ask folks you know, then take risks. Start with folks you know first. Network online, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and other social media platforms. Podcasters are a community of folks with shared values. Who in your community shares your values? And remember, you have a platform when you have a podcast. So localizing our focus. Podcasting can help enact change around certain issues in your local community. Local to you, local to ISU, local to Blono, local to McLean County, Illinois, etc. So in the next part of the workshop, what I'd like for you to do is choose a topic that you're passionate about or invested in and design an interview style podcast or series of episodes about your topic. Who would you interview and why? Would you think about subject matter experts, or would you be interested in talking to different community stakeholders? And how could podcasting contribute to solving this problem? So now we're thinking more about how podcasts can contribute to social change. You know, one of the things that's valuable about research in my area is bringing, localizing our research, what we're looking at, and that also transfers into podcasting as well. So podcasts can help enact change around certain issues in your local community. We've seen this locally, right, in different places. We also see this in more global ways, like with things like cereal early on and stuff like that. So this could be local to you, like perhaps related to your identity as a student or where you might work or something like that. An issue related to ISU and the students at ISU, to the larger Blono community, McLean County, Illinois, et cetera. You can see how this moves outward. So choose a topic you're passionate about or invested in. And that's important. Like, you're a stakeholder in this issue, right? And design an interview style podcast episode or series of episodes about your topic. Who would you interview and why? Are you looking at subject matter experts or other community members and stakeholders? And how could podcasting contribute to solving the problem that you're focused on? Okay, we will move to slide 12. So futures of academic podcasting. I don't love that term, academic podcasting either. Matter of fact, another ISU alumnus, Devin Ralston, and I were talking about academic podcasting the other day. We don't know if that's really a thing. Alas, I'll talk a little bit about reception from the field for my project TBR. I've won a handful of awards from Kairos, like the Service Award and the John Lovis Award, like Dr. Ellison mentioned, and the Michelle Kendrick Award. These are solid awards in our field from top tier journals. And so when we think about academic podcasting and publishing, one of the ways that we can continue to drive their legitimacy is through awards, right? And so I added TBR there, reception of the field, but I added TBR in parentheses because I was talking about myself. But I think the last 3 Michelle Kendrick Awards are all podcast projects. And I think I was the first, maybe 2 of them recently have been John Lovis projects, but that's a big part of this. The next thing when we think about podcasting related to scholarly pursuits in digital publishing, we need to rewrite tenure and promotion guidelines, which understand podcasting as service, to reimagine them as research, as digital spaces for legitimate academic discourse. We can talk about access and equity related to like paywalls and research and knowledge in traditional academic settings, if you want to, related to that. But oftentimes podcast projects that are scholarly in nature have a far wider reach than something behind a paywall. And then feminist research methods, infuse feminist principles in research and production of podcasts. What that means is, like, as you do research, create your podcast, whether that's like a feature podcast on a special topic like dyslexia in McLean County, or whether that's, an ongoing project interview podcast where you have to read bios and uh, uh, promotional materials for books and things like that to make decisions about who to interview. You should think about this, infusing feminist principles into this research and into this production. And so with that, I think I wanted to leave about 20 minutes, 15 or 20 minutes for chatting or questions from you all, if you have them, about starting a podcast. Thanks for sticking with me for about an hour through this talk and workshop. Thanks for contributing. I think it depends on what your goals are and what your format is. For me, I knew early that once I kind of hit a groove that I wanted to be an interview podcast. And so the things that so that was early on, right? So the answer is that from day one, if you find someone you want to talk to, right? But also there is something to be said about building that ethos, right, as an interviewer. And so that's why I say when I go back, on one of the slides about finding guests to interview, talk to folks and see how that goes, right? Maybe record and listen to yourself, something I hate doing. I hate listening to myself. But connected to this are larger concepts, right? Like frequency. How often are you publishing an episode? Because that builds to your ethos as well, right? Dr. Ellison mentioned publishing um, an episode on Monday morning of like a departmental or podcast. Well, that's a great idea. I think that would work really well. But it would need it wouldn't really catch on after week one, it'd be week 2, week 3, week 4, and maybe not on Monday morning since everyone's, scatterbrained and running for the train or the car on Monday mornings, right? I think podcasts have found a groove releasing on Mondays and Thursdays if you have twice a week, and Tuesdays if you release once a week. That's not set in stone, though. But I would say those things, like find folks that you can talk to that be brave when you're ready, and that's going to be different for every podcaster. And then think about how frequency contributes to your ethos as an interview. Some thoughts on that. I do believe that your subject or your content or topic should be your primary driving force on how you approach this. Okay, but for my specific project, the big rhetorical, my interviews are more formal. Okay, now they're not like super formal, but there's a formality to them, right? Even in the way that I develop follow-up questions. I balance that with some informality by having an introduction to the interview, right? Where it's me talking and it can be more off the cuff or more conversational. And maybe I'm highlighting a conference or some other work or talking about the person I'm about to interview. But that might be more informal, right? Talking about my own life. Um, like I said, and academics love to talk about their work. I'm no different than them in that way. As I'm talking about things that I'm doing, that might be more informal. Talking about my personal life, I'm actually recording what I call them bookends. So I record the interview, and then I write and record the bookends, the intro and outro to the interview for the podcast episode. And so I'm recording some bookends this afternoon where I talk a little bit about my personal life and my wife who's and our relationship. And so that's kind of balancing that. So I think that's how I do it. But the answer really should be your content, your topic should guide you there. Yeah. I really appreciate the attention to the tension, because I think that there are some there that could be explicated. Um, so in terms of developing like feminist podcasting methods, and that's a little bit about what we're writing, what I'm writing about recently, is to think about how your topics can, if not should, connect to social justice and creating socially just spaces in what you create, but also contributing to justice at the systemic level. Within that, moving toward like more of a feminist method, I think one of the things, this is really what I want to say, it's about reflexivity for me. I think a lot of that in building our methods here, thinking about what we're doing and why we're doing it throughout the research process. Why are we highlighting, why are we choosing to amplify this specific author who has contributed this specific knowledge, and who else who from a different community who may be not traditionally amplified in that area could talk about that. And so I've really been writing recently this week, even, or I guess last week, since it's Monday, a few days ago, about a reflexive approach to podcasting. And so that's where I'm at right now on that. I think more about, as I learn more about thinking about podcasting and thinking about methods, I tend to talk and think about them in like conceptually, and not necessarily from like methods, like an interview, right? But I think that we can think about them in that way as well, right? Absolutely, which is what you're doing. Particularly like, because I do interviews, we can think about feminist interviewing techniques, right? Certainly there are sources on that out there in my field and across disciplines, I would think. But one of the things, like at the method level, I do there is give that interview questions to the interviewer beforehand. This is a collaboration. And I think that has to be highlighted throughout podcasting. Um, there are podcasts, I guess, with like one person on there, like traditional, radio shows from a mid-American yesteryear, right? But that's not what podcasts are. They're multiple voices. So I think it's about the topics you choose, the resources you bring in. That's another part of this. Who do you cite? And why do you cite them? The politics of citation with podcasting is a whole nother area that we haven't really gotten into. But when you think about feminist citation practices, that can be a big part of podcasting as well. Again, and that I think straddles both the conceptual and the method.